Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Grave Mist, Whisper. Now, I know many of you listen to these stories in the dark, maybe on a long drive, maybe while drifting off to sleep. So before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you heard footsteps crossing a bridge that no longer existed? Tonight's story takes us to the outskirts of a flood-ruined town, where a team of engineers tried to turn a collapsed suspension bridge into a refuge for survivors. But what they built may have connected more than just two sides of a river. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. The road to Northline was still half underwater when the inspection team arrived. What had once been a smooth two-lane highway was now a jagged scar through grey silt and standing pools that reflected a sky without colour. The air smelled of rust and drowned earth, a metallic heaviness that made every breath feel borrowed. Elias Ward, the senior engineer, climbed out of the truck first, scanning the horizon with the careful stillness of a man used to finding problems before they introduced themselves. Behind him, Mira Chen, structural specialist, tightened her rain jacket and checked her clipboard, even though the pages were already soft with moisture. Nolan Rusk, the youngest of the three, hauled the equipment case out of the truck bed and muttered, "Hard to assess something that's half gone." The bridge loomed ahead like a ribcage torn open. The center span, 200 meters of reinforced steel and concrete, had vanished into the fog, leaving the remaining halves hanging in mid-air, cables humming faintly in the wind. Signs from the flood still clung to the structure, tree branches tangled in beams, bits of clothing snagged on bolts, tire marks cut short at the missing edge. A faded caution banner flapped loosely across the barricade, the word "danger" repeating every few feet like a warning that had already failed. They walked in silence until Elias reached the first anchor tower. He ran a hand over the concrete, feeling the damp grit and the fine cracks spidering beneath the surface. "She's old," he said quietly. "Built when over-engineering meant faith." He nodded for Nolan to start the generator. The small machine coughed to life, its buzz echoing strangely across the hollow. Mira placed her sensors along the remaining deck plates, checking stress readings while Elias examined the cable tension gauges. Each ping returned with intolerance, until one sensor spike.
"That can't be right," Mira said, frowning. "We're reading a load on Section C, but Section C doesn't exist anymore."
Elias crossed to her monitor. The data line showed minor vibrations, as though something or someone was walking across the missing span. He tapped the screen. "Could be residual tension, waves from the wind." But even he didn't sound convinced. They continued their survey, working methodically. The fog thickened around them, softening distance, turning sound into suggestion. Every clang of metal seemed to arrive from behind rather than ahead. When they reached the midpoint, the place where the bridge simply stopped, the three of them stood at the brink and stared into a void that swallowed depth perception. The river below was invisible, yet they could hear it breathing, the slow churn of water through twisted debris. That was when Mira noticed the footprints. She crouched near the edge, wiping a hand across the concrete deck. The prints were clear, boot treads, heavy, recent. The toes faced outward, leading straight off the end of the bridge. The last one was half imprinted, as if the person had taken a step into nothing. "Someone was here," she said. "Could be rescue crews," Nolan offered, though his voice betrayed the doubt. Elias knelt beside her, touching the nearest print. The concrete around it was still damp, the edges sharp. "This wasn't hours ago," he murmured. "Minutes, maybe." A faint vibration passed through the deck, subtle but distinct, like a footfall on hollow ground. The generator sputtered once, its light flickering. Elias looked up, following the sound into the fog where the bridge used to be. For an instant, a shadow moved in that emptiness, not drifting like mist, but walking, one step after another. When it vanished, the cables gave a single resonant hum, long and low, as though the bridge itself had sighed. Elias Stray heightened, his face unreadable.
"Mark the location," he said quietly. "We're not alone on this bridge."
By the time dusk reached Northline Bridge, the fog had swallowed the valley completely. The air was colder than it should have been for early summer, sharp, damp and heavy, as if it had seeped straight from the riverbed. The three engineers, Elias Ward, Mira Chen and Nolan Rusk, set up camp near the anchorage, working with the quiet precision of people trained to find order in ruin. Their truck headlights cut thin tunnels through the haze. Beyond that, there was nothing, just the ghostly suggestion of cables vanishing into white. Elias spread inspection maps across a crate, weighting the corners with bolts. "Diagnostics every 2 hours," he said flatly. "If those cables are under strain, I want to know before sunrise." Nolan dragged the generator to the tower base and yanked the cord. The machine sputtered, then caught, humming with mechanical certainty. "Power up," he muttered, forcing a grin that convinced no one. Mira moved along the railing, placing motion sensors every 20 meters. The little devices blinked to life one by one. "If anything moves out there," she said softly, "we'll know." They ate ration pouches beside the floodlight, surrounded by fog that pulsed like something breathing. Occasionally the bridge cables thrummed, a deep metallic vibration that carried through the deck, too low and too deliberate to be mere wind. At 23:30, Nolan checked his gauges. "Fuel stable. Noise levels normal." Elias nodded. "Good. Log it and rest up." But none of them slept. The generator's hum filled the night, steady, patient, almost like a pulse. Mira watched her tablet. Wind velocity, tension load, cable sway, all normal. Yet buried beneath the data were tiny spikes, irregular but repeating, like a heartbeat skipping. At 11:47 p.m. a sensor chirped, then again, then again. Mira sat up fast. "Elias, Sector 3, motion." He rolled to his knees, instantly alert.
Could be wind. It's footsteps," she cut in. "Pacing. Human rhythm." They huddled around the monitor as the pattern scrolled across. 2 steps. Pause. 2 steps. The reading moved halfway across the span, then stopped. Elias lifted his flashlight, beam cutting through the mist. "Hello?" His voice was swallowed whole. No echo. Then came the sound. Faint, metallic, deliberate. The heavy press of a boot on steel. It came from the far side, the missing side. Nolan whispered, "Resonance, maybe." Wind through the deck plates. Mira shook her head. "Plates don't breathe." And that's when they all heard it. The sound of breathing, soft and uneven, far too close. Elias lowered the light. No sudden moves. Just listen. The bridge answered with silence. Then the cables quivered, and a low hum rippled through the deck. Not mechanical, but responsive, like something listening back. The motion sensor blinked once more, and died. The generator stuttered. The floodlights flickered. Then total darkness. In that perfect airless pause, Mira swore she heard a single step behind her. Solid, close, human. When the lights returned, the bridge was still. Elias exhaled, jaw tight. "We keep the logs running," he said. "If something's crossing this bridge..." He glanced into the mist. "We'll know when it comes back." By the 3rd week at Northline, the engineers had stopped thinking of themselves as inspectors. The bridge was no longer just a structure, it was becoming a line between 2 worlds. One side held the broken remains of the flooded town. The other was a rising encampment of the displaced, drawn to the only dry ground left for miles. It began with a family of 4 who arrived at dawn in a half-flooded sedan. Their headlights glowed weakly through the fog, and when they saw the engineers' campfire burning at the bridge entrance, they wept with relief. Elias let them through without hesitation. Mira was against it at first. "We're not equipped for civilians," she said. But Elias only replied, "Neither is anywhere else." By nightfall, 3 more groups had arrived, a truck carrying 2 elderly men and a dog, a young woman pushing a cart of salvaged blankets, a teenager still in a soaked school uniform, all of them tired, all of them asking the same question. Is it safe here? So the engineers did what engineers do. They built. The toll booths became small shelters, stripped of their broken glass and lined with sheet metal from the old road signs. Nolan scavenged floodlights from abandoned vehicles and wired them into a grid powered by the generator. Mira rigged makeshift stoves from rusted barrels, welding holes for airflow. They created a cooking station beneath the anchorage tower and reinforced the railings with rebar so children wouldn't slip through the gaps. Within a few days, a small community had formed. People called it the Span. It wasn't meant to last. It was just supposed to hold. But soon, there were nearly 20 souls sleeping between the towers, huddled under tarps that flapped in the constant wind. At first, the nights were quiet. The sound of rain on metal lulled people to sleep, and the steady hum of the generator was comforting. Then came the noises. "They be," Egan softly, a faint twang of a tension cable at impossible hours, a rhythmic knock that seemed to travel the length of the bridge. Some said it was just wind pushing against the cables, but the pattern was too deliberate. 3 slow creaks, pause, then 2 quick ones. A code, maybe. One night, Mira woke to a metallic clang that echoed from the far end, the broken section that ended in fog. She thought it was a piece of scrap falling, but when she went to check, nothing had moved. Instead, she found the motion sensors blinking in sequence, left to right, one after another, as if something invisible were walking past them. Elias decided to tighten patrols. He trained a few of the stronger refugees to stand watch in pairs, armed with tools more than weapons, wrenches, hammers, and flashlights. They took shifts from midnight to 4 a.m., logging every sound. Within days, the notebook was full. Notes like, "Heard footsteps under deck." Sounded like chains scraping steel. Voices, "Can't tell direction." But what unsettled them most were the harmonics. At dusk, when the sun dipped below the fog and the valley filled with pink light, the entire bridge would begin to hum. Not the low groan of wind through steel, but a deep, resonant vibration, like a choir trapped inside the metal itself. It seemed to respond to noise, swelling when people spoke, quieting when everyone fell silent. One child, a quiet girl named Leah, told Mira that the bridge was talking to itself. When asked what it said, she whispered, "It's counting." That night, the generator died without warning. The floodlights went dark, plunging the span into blackness. From somewhere beyond the edge, a single cable plucked itself, low, soft, deliberate. Then came another, and another. By morning, the people of the span agreed on 2 things. The bridge was holding, and something beneath it was listening. By the end of their 2nd month on the bridge, Mira Chen had stopped sleeping. Not from fear, but from the kind of restless curiosity that gnaws at a scientist who knows she's hearing something that shouldn't exist. Every night the bridge made noises, metal expanding, bolts shifting, cables humming. But lately, the sounds had taken on rhythm. Not random creaks, not the weather. Something ordered. It began during a storm. She'd been cataloguing acoustic delay readings, simple impulse response tests. Tap the railing with a hammer, record how long the echo took to return, then plot the decay curve. Normally, the reflection bounced cleanly from the far anchorage tower or the remaining deck. But that night, her data went wrong. Each tap returned 2 echoes, one from the far end, as expected, and another from somewhere beneath her feet. The second echo wasn't a true reflection. It was delayed by fractions of a second, and it grew louder with each tap, like whatever was producing it was moving closer. Mira thought it was a software glitch. She recalibrated her instruments, changed microphones,
even swapped out batteries. The pattern remained. When she told Elias, he frowned, rubbing a hand along the damp railing. "Metal fatigue," he said. "Water in the joints. The sound just bounces weird." But even as he said it, his eyes drifted toward the fog beneath them. So Mira tested again. She tied a length of rope around her waist, clipped into a safety line, and climbed halfway down the anchorage tower where the deck met the suspension cable. Each hammer strike rang out through the valley, a bright, bell-like tone that hung in the mist. And every time she struck the steel, there came an answer, slightly slower, slightly lower, as if someone below was striking back. Elias ordered her up immediately. "No more solo tests," he barked. "Not until we understand what's resonating." That night, the bridge hummed again, the sound rising from beneath the missing span like a deep throat clearing itself. People in the span stirred from sleep. Some claimed they heard voices in the vibration, low, guttural syllables that carried through the beams. Nolan brought her the audio recordings the next morning. He'd synced the timestamps with her hammer strikes. "Listen," he said, turning up the volume. The first few sounds were normal, metal on metal. But at the seventh strike, a faint secondary rhythm emerged. Not random, measured. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats again, like climbing steps. "That's not echo," Mira whispered. Together, they ran a spectrum analysis. The response wasn't just reflection. It had modulation, a rise and fall that suggested intent. When they converted it to a visual waveform, the peaks formed a diagonal line, like footsteps ascending. That evening, Mira ran one final test. She attached accelerometers along the suspension cable itself to track vibration propagation. Around midnight, the sensors began lighting up one by one, starting near the broken end of the bridge and moving steadily upward. "Something's climbing," Nolan muttered. Elias grabbed the floodlight and aimed it into the fog. The beam cut through white nothing, revealing only coils of mist twisting around the cables. For a moment, the light caught movement, like hands gripping steel, wet and pale. Then it was gone. The cable trembled violently, followed by a metallic groan that echoed through the towers. Mira's laptop showed the last sensor spike at her own position, 0 meters. Whatever was climbing had reached the top. Then, the sound stopped. No echo, no vibration. Only silence, heavy enough to make the fog itself seem still. Mira stood frozen, staring at her screen as the readings flatlined. Slowly, she turned toward Elias. "It's not the bridge echoing us," she said quietly. "We're the ones echoing it." That night, none of them slept, and for the first time, the bridge didn't hum. It listened. The first convoy appeared on a Sunday morning, not that days meant much anymore. Time on the span was measured in fuel levels and fog density, not calendars. Mira had been monitoring cable tension while Nolan cleaned the generator filters when they heard the low rumble of engines approaching from the western road. Trucks, 3 of them, moving in tight formation. Elias was on the tower walkway when he saw them emerge through the mist. 2 pickup trucks armored with welded scrap and a larger cargo vehicle with an improvised plow mounted on the front. The bridge had been quiet for weeks, only the wind and the hum of the cables for company. The sudden roar of engines sounded like a storm. The trucks stopped just short of the barricade. 6 men climbed out, all armed. They wore mismatched uniforms, bits of camouflage, construction vests, and one in what looked like a police jacket turned inside out. The leader, a thick-necked man with a beard flecked in grey, raised his hand in greeting. "You folks with the state?" he called. "We're with the recovery effort out of Brookvale. Got orders to reclaim infrastructure." Elias came down to meet them, his rifle slung across his chest but angled down. He didn't like the way they looked, too clean for travelers, too rehearsed in their swagger. "This bridge isn't operational," Elias said evenly. "Half the span's gone. Nobody's crossing until we verify structural integrity."
The man laughed, showing teeth gone yellow from cigarettes. We're not crossing. We're rebuilding. Got cables, got tools, got manpower. You'll want to let us through before things get crowded. Mira stepped up beside Elias. We don't need outside crews, she said. This site is secure. If you've got supplies to trade, we'll talk, but nobody starts stringing cables without authorization. The leader's eyes narrowed. Authorization? Lady, the world's underwater. You think you're in charge of this bridge? He spat into the mud and gestured for his men. They moved back to their trucks, unloading spools of steel wire and harness gear. Within minutes, they were hammering anchor hooks into the ground near the broken section. Mira watched them work with grim disbelief. Elias called over the radio, his voice tight. Nolan, kill the generator. No power to the west grid until further notice. When the floodlights went dark, the fog thickened instantly, swallowing the edges of the world. The men cursed and flicked on handheld lamps that barely cut through the haze. From above, the bridge cables hummed faintly, a sound that made the refugees retreat into their shelters. Around midnight, the air changed. The hum deepened into a slow vibration that ran through the deck, through the steel, through bone. Nolan, watching from the tower, swore he saw the cables move, not sway, move, like something inside them was crawling. Down below, the convoy's lamps began to flicker. The men shouted orders, voices sharp with panic. One of them fired a warning shot into the fog. The sound echoed back, distorted, like the bullet had ricocheted through water. Then came the noise, a tearing metallic shriek, followed by a chorus of snapping wires. The shouting stopped. The lights went out one by one. When dawn came, the fog thinned enough for them to see what was left. The trucks were still there, but stripped. Every cable the men had hung was gone. The spools had been pulled apart, wire uncoiled and twisted into the air like vines reaching toward the missing span. Only a few strands of rope remained, shredded and dangling from the railing, swaying gently as if stirred by breath. Mira whispered, "It didn't want to be rebuilt." Elias watched the torn cables tremble and said nothing. But deep down, he knew she was right. The bridge wasn't a ruin waiting to be, he fixed. It was alive enough to protect itself. By late autumn, fog had become the constant resident of Northline Bridge. It rolled in before dawn and refused to leave, clinging to every bolt and cable like a second skin. Most of the span's inhabitants had stopped noticing it, except Nolan Rusk. The generator technician had always listened more than he spoke, and lately he'd been hearing something new. It started as a tremor, faint, steady, buried beneath the usual vibration of wind through steel. When he placed his hand on the deck plating, he could feel it, a rhythm so regular it seemed deliberate. He thought at first it was the echo of the river's current against the pilings. But when he hooked the seismic sensors to a readout screen, the pattern appeared clear as a pulse. Every 42 seconds, a soft thump resonated through the bridge's underbelly. Could be pressure changes, Elias suggested when Nolan brought it up during their evening debrief. Air pockets under the structure, the floodwaters still shifting. But Nolan shook his head. Pressure doesn't keep time. He showed them the data, 4 hours of readings, perfectly spaced, the same amplitude each time. Whatever's down there, he said, tapping the monitor. It's moving. Mira leaned over the screen, frowning. Then we find the source. At dawn, they descended the maintenance ladder attached to the anchorage tower, stopping at the edge where the deck had collapsed months before. Beyond that was nothing but a gulf of white. The fog swirled below like boiling milk, and the cables disappeared into it as if they'd been swallowed. Nolan set 3 new sensors along the rim, checking alignment. He crouched to connect the last cable when the pulse hit again. The metal beneath his boots trembled. Once, clean and steady, like a single heartbeat through the floor. There, he said quietly. You feel that? Elias nodded. Under the missing span. Directly. Below us. Mira unpacked the inspection probe, a long, weatherproof camera mounted on a retractable cable. She checked the battery, wiped condensation from the lens, and fed it over the edge. The cable hissed through the winch as the camera dropped into fog. 30 meters, Nolan read from the monitor. Nothing visible but white noise and drifting debris. 40, 45. Then the signal spiked. The sensor alarms chirped in sequence. 1, 2, 3. The same rhythm as the pulse. Something's right under us, Nolan said, gripping the winch handle. 5 meters below the break. Mira adjusted the camera angle, panning left. For a moment, all they saw was vapor. Then, something darker moved within it, a shadow clinging to the underside of a cable. The autofocus struggled, sharpening just long enough for one frame to freeze. It was a hand. Human. Wet, pale, the fingers locked around steel strands. "Pull it up!" Elias barked. Mira reeled the cable in, but halfway up, resistance caught. A sudden, sharp jerk, like someone below had grabbed the line. The winch whined, gears straining. Then, just as quickly, it released. The camera shot upward, spinning wildly, smearing the image into static. When it surfaced, the lens was cracked. The recording saved automatically to Nolan's terminal. 11 seconds of footage, looping between static bursts and a single clear image of the hand. They replayed it again and again, but something changed each time. Sometimes the fingers appeared clenched, sometimes open. Once the hand wasn't empty. It seemed to hold a fragment of cloth, dark and dripping. "Someone's down there," Mira whispered. "Or what's left of someone." Elias stared into the fog. The pulse continued, steady as ever, 42 seconds apart, like a clock refusing to die. He exhaled slowly. "Not someone," he said. "Something that remembers how to hold on." That night, the pulse grew louder, and when the sensors logged its location, it wasn't beneath the bridge anymore. It was directly beneath them. The bridge had begun keeping its own records. What started as a simple ration notebook had turned into something else, something none of them could explain. Mira had made the ledger herself. A plain weatherproof binder to track supply runs, names of volunteers, and timestamps for when each team left and returned. It was her way of creating order, of pretending the span was still a civil project instead of a settlement built on borrowed time. For weeks it worked. The pages filled neatly with check marks, notes on fuel, and repair tasks. But one grey morning, when the fog pressed close to the deck and the air smelled like wet iron, the ledger changed. Elias found it first. He had risen before sunrise to inspect the west cables and noticed the binder lying open on the crate where Mira always kept it. A faint breeze turned the pages. What caught his eye were the new entries. Fresh ink, still damp, but Mira hadn't written them. There were 4 names: Tyler, Rosa, Malik, and June. All 4 had left on a supply run 2 nights earlier. Next to each name was a small mark, a single vertical tally. When Mira woke, Elias showed her the page. "Did you add these?" he asked. She frowned. "No, I locked it last night." Nolan checked the binder. The latch wasn't broken. There were no footprints near the crate, just the slick sheen of dew. He ran a finger across the ink. It smudged faintly, as though written moments before dawn. "Maybe they radioed in," Mira suggested, though her voice didn't sound convinced. She switched on the receiver. Nothing, just static and the low thrum of interference that had haunted their frequency for weeks. By noon, word had spread through the span. The refugees whispered about omens, about the bridge knowing who wouldn't return. Mira dismissed it publicly, but privately, she kept staring at the ledger, flipping the pages, hoping to find her own handwriting some. Iware. That night, they waited for the runners. No headlights appeared on the far road. No voices came through the fog. When dawn broke, the bridge was still. Mira opened the ledger again. The names were still there, but the tallies had changed. Each mark now had a second line beside it, forming the shape of crosses. And at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that wasn't hers, a new sentence had appeared. Return to the span below. She tore the page out and burned it over the stove. The smoke curled and vanished through the open window. "We don't talk about this," she said quietly. "We just wait." The next morning, another page was written. Same names, same crosses, and new ones. People who hadn't left the bridge at all. Elias's name, Nolan's, even hers. She checked the back of the page, blank. The ink wasn't bleeding through. It had appeared on clean paper, perfectly aligned in her own handwriting. Nolan suggested moving the ledger off the bridge. He carried it to the anchorage tower and left it in a sealed locker overnight. When he opened it the next morning, the pages were damp from condensation. But the writing had spread, thin, ghost-like letters etched across the metal itself, as if the ink had soaked through into steel. Mira ran her palm along the rail to steady herself. Her fingers came away wet, and when she looked down, words were forming there too, condensed out of the morning dew. Names, dates, tallies. The air grew cold enough that her breath turned white. Elias whispered, "It's taking attendance." By sunrise, the dew had dried, but the faint writing remained, burned into the metal by something that didn't need paper anymore. And when Mira flipped open the ledger that night, she saw a single new line at the bottom. Last entry pending. The page was otherwise blank, except for the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the paper, as if someone had signed in from the other side. The storm rolled in from the west with no warning, one of those fast, grey tempests that seemed to come from nowhere and swallow the horizon whole. By noon, the air had turned electric, thick with the metallic taste of pressure. The cables of Northline Bridge thrummed under the shifting wind, low and uneasy, like a throat clearing before a scream. Elias was already on edge. The seismic pulse that had haunted the bridge for weeks had grown stronger, vibrating through the deck plates even when the air was still. Mira said it was probably pressure buildup in the anchor housings, but no one really believed that anymore. By sunset, the first thunderclap shook the valley. Lightning split the fog like a flashbulb, and for an instant, the entire bridge appeared stark and skeletal against a bruised sky. The refugees ran for cover beneath the towers, clutching blankets, children and fuel drums. Mira shouted for everyone to move their gear off the exposed deck, while Nolan shut down the generator to prevent a surge. The next bolt hit close, too close. The sound bounced through the metal, and the cables hummed a long, discordant note that made everyone stop. Elias felt it through his boots, the kind of vibration that came from deep within the structure itself. He looked toward the west tower and saw one of the suspension cables fraying, strands snapping in sharp white arcs of energy. "Get back!" he yelled. The cable tore loose with a sound like the earth itself splitting open. It whipped free from the tower and snapped downward into the fog, dragging sparks and shrapnel with it. The impact shook the deck, sending a wave of motion through the bridge so violent that every loose object rattled and rolled. Then, through the fading thunder came something else. Footsteps. They weren't running or staggering like panicked humans. They were deliberate, steady, echoing through the metal a drumbeat on hollow ground. Mira grabbed the binoculars and aimed toward the missing span. Lightning flashed again, and her breath caught. "Elias, there are people down there." He snatched the binoculars from her, adjusting the focus. The next flash of lightning froze the scene in a perfect white photograph. Dozens of figures moved through the mist beneath the broken deck. Their silhouettes were black against the strobing sky, walking in straight lines where there was no floor to stand on. Some held hands,
Some carried shapes that looked like tools or lanterns. All of them were moving toward the anchored side of the bridge, as if returning home. "They're on the air," Nolan whispered. Another flash, closer this time. The figures vanished. The fog churned like boiling water, rolling toward them in thick waves that made the bridge sway. The deck vibrated again, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat pulse from the sensors. 42 seconds apart. Exact. Methodical. Mira ran to the monitoring station, fingers flying over the keys. Every device was lighting up, one after another, showing motion signatures all along the span. "They're crossing," she said, "but there's nothing to cross." The lightning stuttered across the valley again, and the generator flickered back to life, on its own. The floodlights blinked, illuminating the deck, the cables, the trembling towers. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the wind stopped. Silence fell heavy as the fog sank back into the river below. The air smelled of ozone and burning steel. Elias exhaled shakily. "Status check," he said. Mira stared at the screen. Every motion sensor was blinking in perfect unison. Same line, same phrase, repeating over and over in steady green text. "Crossing complete." No one moved. The rain began again, soft this time, tapping the metal in a sound almost like applause. When Mira looked up, she saw damp footprints leading from the missing span to the center of the deck, and they were still wet. By the time the storm cleared, Northline Bridge looked like it had survived a war. Half of the west tower was blackened from lightning strikes, cables hung like torn veins, and every surface was slick with ash and rain. The survivors slept in clusters beneath the remaining span, too afraid to stand near the rails. The bridge had been groaning all night, as if something heavy beneath it was learning how to breathe. At dawn, the fog thinned enough for them to see what the night had built. Hanging beneath the broken midsection was a new structure, impossible, grotesque, and deliberate. It looked like a second bridge suspended beneath the first, woven together from scavenged debris. Car doors, twisted rebar, and chunks of driftwood. Between the gaps, they could see something white lashed into the framework. When the sun broke through, they realized it wasn't plastic. It was bone. The air was unnaturally still. The new span swayed ever so slightly, as though something below was still working on it, adjusting angles, tightening knots. Mira stood at the edge, hand gripping a cable, unable to look away. "It's growing," she whispered. Nolan didn't answer. He was staring at the seismic monitor, where a fresh pattern had appeared. Every 42 seconds, the same pulse they had tracked for weeks repeated. But now, it came in sequences of 2, 4, 1. He jotted it down, cross-referenced with binary. When he finished, he looked pale. "It's a word," he said. "It says, rebuild." Mira turned toward him. "You think something, down there is sending it?" Before he could reply, Elias climbed onto the railing. His welding mask hung around his neck, and the portable torch was strapped to his back. He looked almost calm. "Elias," Mira called, stepping forward. "Don't even think about it." He kept his eyes on the hanging structure. "You saw what it did. It's mimicking us. It's learning." "That's not learning," Nolan snapped. "That's imitation. It's building something for itself, not for us." Elias shook his head. "Doesn't matter. A structure is still a structure. It wants connection. Maybe if we finish what it started, it'll stop." Mira grabbed his arm, but he pulled free gently. "We've been patching bridges our whole lives," he said. "Maybe this one's just asking for the same." Before she could stop him, he clipped a line to his harness and started down the ladder toward the fog. The sound of his boots faded quickly, swallowed by mist and the low hum from below. They heard the hiss of his torch ignite, a small flare of orange barely visible through the grey. Then came a sound like laughter, soft, hollow, rising from the cables. Minutes passed. Mira shouted his name again and again, but the fog gave no answer. The welding arc flickered once more, brighter this time, and then went dark. The hum stopped. The seismic monitor flatlined. When they finally pulled the cable back up, the harness was still attached. The hook was fused shut, the metal twisted into a spiral like it had been melted and rewound. Elias's torch was missing. That night, the bridge stayed silent. Even the wind refused to touch it. Just before sunrise, Mira woke to a faint glow through the fog. She stepped out of her tent and stared toward the broken span. Down below, the makeshift bridge was lit from within, small, flickering orange points moving slowly along its length, like torches in human hands. The hum returned, steady, rhythmic, and this time there was something new beneath it, the crackle of a welding torch, methodical, patient. Nolan turned to Mira. "That's his frequency," he said quietly. And from below the bridge, through the static of the sensors, came a voice that almost sounded like Elias. "Load test commencing." Then silence. When dawn fully broke, the fog cleared. Just enough to reveal new sections added overnight, symmetrical, seamless, and impossibly fast. The bridge was building again. The days after Elias's disappearance stretched into a kind of muted eternity. No one at the span spoke his name out loud, but everyone felt the absence, the gap he'd left in the air, like a cable suddenly gone slack. Mira threw herself into the work, checking tension readings and patching seams that didn't need it, pretending that numbers could fill the silence. Nolan stayed near the radio shack, the static hissing endlessly in the background, as if the bridge itself were breathing through the wires. It was nearly 3 weeks before the voice came through. Mira had been asleep beside her maps when the first crackle broke the monotony. The radio stuttered, buzzed, and then steadied. The voice that followed was unmistakable, calm, steady, warm with familiarity. "Bridge integrity 96%, it said. "Proceed with crossing." She sat upright, the chair scraping against concrete. "Elias?" Static. Then again the same line, identical in tone and cadence, as though he were reading from a checklist. "Bridge integrity 96%, proceed with crossing." The refugees stirred. Nolan sprinted inside, headset half on, fingers trembling over the dials. "It's his voice," he muttered. "Signal strength at full. Directions coming from below the deck." "Playback?" Mira demanded. He recorded it, looped it, slowed it down. The inflection never changed. No breath, no background noise, no distortion from wind or distance. It wasn't a transmission bouncing from another tower. It was broadcasting from somewhere directly beneath them. By nightfall, the entire bridge seemed to hum in tune with the voice. The rails vibrated softly, almost comfortingly, like a lullaby played through steel. The remaining residents of the span gathered in silence, faces lit by the flicker of old lanterns, listening to Elias's voice repeat its impossible report. "Bridge integrity 96%. Proceed with corrals." "Oh, sing." At midnight, the fog began to glow. Mira walked to the edge, holding a flashlight she never turned on. Beneath the torn midsection of Northline Bridge, faint points of light shimmered, rows of them, moving slowly through the mist. At first, she thought they were reflections, maybe the flicker of distant towns. But the pattern was too organized. 2 by 2, the lights advanced in straight lanes, tracing a perfect path across a bridge that no longer existed. "Headlights," Nolan whispered beside her. "Vehicles. Impossible." They stood there for a long time, watching the quiet procession of phantom traffic gliding across the void. No engines, no sound, just the soft pulse of illumination drifting beneath the fog, like a memory that refused to fade. Then the generator roared to life. No one had touched it. The fuel line was still disconnected, yet the engine spun,
caught, and began to run at perfect idle. The floodlights along the deck flickered on, one by one, until the whole upper span glowed like it had in the days before the flood. The air filled with warmth, the faint scent of ozone and hot steel. Mira stepped forward to the railing, whispering the words she'd heard 100 times from Elias during their inspections. "Load test commencing." The hum deepened. The lights below grew brighter, their rhythm aligning with the pulse of the generator. The deck beneath her feet trembled, steady, measured, alive. "Mira!" Nolan shouted, but she didn't turn. Her gaze was fixed on the fog, where the last pair of lights reached the far side and vanished. The radio crackled again. "Crossing complete," Elias's voice said softly. And then, after a pause, words that didn't belong to any checklist. "Mira, you can let go now." The generator sputtered once, then fell silent. When the sun rose, the fog had lifted. The bridge stood empty. No cables snapped, no seams torn. Everything. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story, the bridge at Northline. What do you think was really happening on that bridge? Did Elias rebuild it? Or did the bridge rebuild him? Let me know your theory in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this eerie mystery, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves realistic horror. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never follow footsteps that lead into fog.